Welcome back to the second part about the magnetic evil and the persona of the dictator Adolf Hitler. And without further delay, let's pick up where we left off. The common feelings of loss, despair, frustration, and anger from losing the First World War united these men. However, these were not uncommon sentiments in Germany. At the time, something else activated and fueled their extremism. All had experienced some kind of revelation. Whilst listening to Hitler, he seemed to be an outsider, somebody almost sent to Germany to help Germany regain its trajectory to great past status, to help Germany revenge itself on the Allies. He was fulfilling a kind of prefigured role, which had always existed in German history and culture. Kaiser Frederick Barbarossa, King Redbeard, the man who would deliver Germany from her enemies. And specifically now those enemies were gathering thick and furious around them for Hitler. All the signs were pointing towards a burgeoning National Socialist political party. He had managed to gather around him a loyal following, and some meetings were running into the thousands. It was events in Italy, however, which ignited Hitler's imagination. They would have huge consequences on the fate of Hitler, the National Socialist Party, and the rest of the German nation. Hitler had gathered some of the brightest and most dangerous men from the far right. His National Socialist meetings often brought in around 20 participants, but Hitler's perception of himself and his party was grossly exaggerated. He's a kind of man in a dirty raincoat, standing on a soapbox in the middle of a town square, talking to half a dozen people standing on platforms on street corners, and so on, in an old-fashioned kind of political activity. There were other far more powerful, far more publicly visible right-wing parties in Germany at the time. Well, it really was just an assembly of people who come together, who shared roughly the same kinds of views. Events in Italy inspired Hitler. The bombastic newspaper editor with a gladiator's jaw led his black-shirted legions in a march on Rome. In October 1922, the fascist leader Mussolini and his black-shirt army marched on Rome. King Victor Emmanuel Roman III was forced to hand control of Italy to Mussolini. At least, this is how Hitler saw it, and almost immediately began to plot his own coup. Hitler was very influenced in 1983 by the successful coup staged by Mussolini. Hitler conceived the idea of a march on Berlin, so he began to fantasize in 1953 that the German mistake was so weak, the height of the inflation, the crisis, and so on. He took advantage of the disintegration of German politics in 1923, and at the presence of hyperinflation, the French occupation of the Ruhr, to seize reparations which won't be delivered, to stage a coup d'état in Munich. Mussolini was also well aware of the power of propaganda. He knew how he wished to be perceived by the rest of Europe. Hitler was one of the victims of Mussolini's propaganda. King appointed Mussolini head of government in a perfectly constitutional way. It was not a coup d'état, it was a perfectly constitutional act on the part of the king, if a rather weak-willed one. It was all a bit of a gamble from Hitler's point of view. On November 8, 1923, Hitler, along with 600 stormtroopers, surrounded the Burger Brau Keller, a large beer hall in Munich. Here, the state commissioner of Bavaria, Gustav von Kahr, was holding a meeting of around 3,000 people. Hitler marched and fired a shot into the air and announced that the revolution had broken out and no one could leave overnight. Hitler attempted to take power from von Kahr, but failed. It was decided early in the morning of November 9th that they would march out of the beer hall towards the Bavarian Ministry of Defense. On the way, they were confronted by the Bavarian police. Hitler hoped that the new German army, the post-imperial creation of the Reichswehr, would support them. It wasn't backed by the army. The industrial elites refused to support it. The civil service regarded it with contempt. When the Munich police opened fire, most of them turned tail. Some of them were hit, some wounded, a few killed. But it was built up into an iconic episode in the history of the movement. Hitler was arrested, put on trial. His trial began on February 26, 1924, and ended on the 1st of April. Other conspirators, such as Rudolf Hess, were also arrested and tried in court. The whole episode seemed to be a complete failure on the part of Hitler and the National Socialist Party. What the Bill Hall Porch does, which is marvelous for the Nazis, is provide them with martyrs and provide them with a myth, a legend, and a whole new symbol structure. For example, the blood flag, which is the flag carried on that very day, and when they fall is after that time the core sacramental edifice of the Nazi process, so that at Nuremberg all of the standards of the stormtroopers are touched by the blood. Flag. The martyrs are symbolically reburied in vast marble sarcophagi in the center of Munich after the Nazis take power, and every year there is the famous reenactment of the porch where they march down the streets. There is a death watch held throughout Germany the night before. There are radio link-ups, everything is broadcast, great films, smoldering beers, flames, the whole work, and if it sounds quasi-religious, it is the Nazi flag. The swastika, which Hitler purported to have designed himself, was taken from an ancient symbol embodying early Aryan history. The swastika is an ancient Buddhist symbol. You see it all over India and in China, and it has always been around. It was originally a symbol of the sun, but it began to be acquired by the German right in the late 19th century as one of their symbols because they felt it stood for the idea of being an Aryan. It was Hitler's changes to the design which marked it out as the Nazi symbol. The story he tells is that he invited people to submit designs and swastikas came in, and none of them, he said, quite did the job, so he said, I'll do it myself, and that's what he worked on. It's a series of simple design formulae which are applied to it. The flag is in the colors of red, black, and white, which are the old imperial colors to contrast with the red golden, black of the Republic. What he did very brilliantly, and I'm so much reluctant to say this, it's fantastic piece of graphic design. He took it, he rotated it to give it a sense of dynamism. He then calculated the widths of the bars very brilliantly. He then set it in this circle, and it doesn't quite touch the edges, which gives it a kind of vibration and dynamism. And then this red outer bit, so in all the aesthetic, there's a massive amount of red to stand for the sexualist part, and it just goes poof, and by the 1920s it had become the authorized symbol. He said it was going to be the Nazi symbol, and it was the Nazi symbol. At his trial, Hitler had taken sole responsibility for the push. It is reported that the judges found it hard not to acquit Hitler due to their pro-Nazi sympathies. Finally, the sentence of 5 years of confinement was passed. He was also banned from public speaking. Testament to the fact that his oratory was a key factor in the rise of the National Socialist Party. The enforced silence and confinement gave Hitler time for introspection. The outlet for his thoughts now came through the pen. The German state, the Bible of the Nazis. He didn't actually think until the porch. It doesn't seem to us that he was the chosen one, he was the Messiah. It's only at his time in Lansbury prison that he actually realizes, my God, I am he, and is somehow liberated into becoming what he does in fact become. He served less than a year of his sentence. He served with Rudolf Hess amongst others, and he used the time to write Mein Kampf. Democracy is a Manchester city born of filth and fire. It's interesting that Hitler decided when he was sent off to prison in 1924 that he would take this opportunity to sit back and write a book about his experiences, how he'd reached the point it reached, why he had the beliefs that he did. But it was very important for him to do that, I think, to sit back and take stock of, of how he arrived there. The headless title for the original manuscript was My 4.5-Year Struggle Against Lies, Paradise, and Stupidity, a Final Reckoning with Those Who Would Destroy the German Nation. Well, his publishers recommended to Amigo for something that might be a little snappier and catchier for the market, so they extrapolated the 2 words, My Struggle, Mein Kampf. The really interesting part of it is the famous 5th chapter, which is a theory of propaganda. The rest of it are really a collection of emotional spastics. It's not a recipe for a system as, for example, Marx is with the Communist Manifesto. And his capital God has made Germans a race of supermen. Almighty God bless our German blood. The publisher shifted 300,000 copies and many more for perhaps obvious reasons. After that, the big book, the original thing, hefty volume, you're talking about 600 pages. The writing of Mein Kampf fueled his desire for power and the need to lead Germany. However, Hitler knew he would need a different route to domination, but without being able to speak publicly, it would have to wait. Stopping him from speaking was going to keep the peace. He was regarded as an influential speaker. I think you were looking for an explanation for why it took a long time for the party to revive again and for the public to really take it. But seriously, again, it was the ban on his speaking. He alone in Germany is not allowed to speak, so used that as propaganda really to attack the Weimar government for censorship. In 1927, the ban on Hitler's public speaking was relaxed and later lifted completely once more Hitler took to the stage. Something about his performance is something about that which really attracted people, like modern-day pop stars. There are people who do appear to have been mesmerized by him. As soon as he could start speaking, you have that run-up to the successful parliamentary elections in the late 1920s. When I look at Hitler on the stage, I think of him as being in a political theater, but I don't believe that what he says is great oratory. At the time of Hitler's silence, Germany began to see a certain recovery thanks to American investment. Unemployment was declining and the economy was improving. A sense of optimism rippled through the German nation. A lot of Americans invested, so Germany looked as if it was prospering. By 1928, the National Socialists could have been banished to the history books as a marginal far-right political party with their eccentric leader and the failed beer hall push of 1923. However, fate dealt them a favorable hand, the post-war economic recovery under the Weimar Republic, which was genuine enough while it lasted that had collapsed as a direct result of the Wall Street crash in New York. It was a saying of the time: New York sneezed, London caught cold, and Germany nearly died of influenza. Music. The implications of the crash would eventually lead the National Socialist Party to total power. The continuity of the Great Depression was absolutely critical. 7 million men became unemployed. There seemed to be no lifting. And once you got the worker in the dole queue, you had him as a potential Nazi, a potential stormtrooper. What further measures would be imposed on the German population to consolidate the Nazis' power, and what terror would be unleashed before the dramatic toppling of this evil regime? World War I had left Germany in a state of shock. 2 million fatalities spiraling. Inflation and unpaid debts to the Allied countries caused the nation to feel stripped of its identity and pride. They felt that the Allies had deceived them, had abandoned all notions of honor by treating them as a conquered people. Hitler was a war hero. He won the Iron Cross first class. The First World War turned a nobody into a somebody. Adolf Hitler had survived the conflict and found a political home in the German Workers' Party, a right-wing organization with racist and anti-Semitic roots. Hitler, like many others, had to find some way of explaining it to himself. Unlike tens of thousands of others, we blame socialist Marxist Jews, people who undermined Germany from within. Climbing the ranks, he changed the name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party and took control. He was fulfilling a prefigured role which had always existed in German history and culture, the man who would deliver Germany from her enemies. As leader, he started plotting the takeover of Munich, and in turn Germany. The infamous beer hall push was a resounding failure. It was built up into an iconic episode in the history of the movement. Hitler was arrested, put on trial. Hitler was later imprisoned. His intentions, however, were still for total power and to return the nation to a state of pride. Hitler knew that he would need a different approach. First of all, he had to get the army, police, civil service, and business on his side. And secondly, he had to develop a propaganda apparatus which would win votes. If we can't outshoot them, without vote them, and we'll do it by winning support. He would fuse violent acts of terror with slick propaganda, which would all fuel this fatal attraction. In the late 1920s, the Nazi Party found themselves with diminishing support as the German economy became stronger. In 1920, Germany was in quite reasonable circumstances. There had been a recovery from the Depression, after the war recovery from the inflation. With the stabilization of the currency in 1924, the economy appeared to be booming. This was largely because there was an enormous influx of American money. The Germans spent a lot of the loan money on things that were very desirable, like concert halls and swimming pools and so on, but they weren't productive, so Germany looked as if it was prospering. Unforeseen events in the world economy would end up having huge ramifications for Germany. Post-war economic recovery under the Weimar Republic, which was genuine enough while it lasted, that had collapsed, that had gone into free fall as I had a direct result of the Wall Street crash in New York. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The New York Stock Exchange is in a panic. Frantic investors have scrambled to unload their stocks at any price. Everyone wants to sell, no one wants to buy. Suddenly, even the most gilt-edged securities are practically valueless. The stock market crash has come, and the Great Depression has begun. They just pulled the rug out from Germany. They just withdrew their investments. American banks withdrew the loans on which a German recovery after the hyperinflation of 2023 had depended. German banks collapsed. They withdrew their money from businesses. Businesses collapsed. So many of the loans particularly had been made on a 14-day basis. They could just withdraw them. So the German economy contracted very suddenly, very quickly. Every European country was affected. Germany was disastrously affected. There was a saying of the time: New York sneezed, London caught cold, and Germany nearly died of influenza. It really was first and foremost a crisis of industrial society, and the major unemployment was in industry, particularly the building trade. By 1932, there was 35 to 40% unemployment in Germany. That is how catastrophic the depression was. When you throw manual workers out of jobs, of course, the people who are the clerks in these occupations suffer as well. The continuity of the Great Depression was absolutely critical, and once you got the worker in the door queue, you had him as a potential Nazi, a potential stormtrooper. The people of Germany were down and out, and the now called National Socialist Party had found a cause to champion that would increase their visibility and popularity in that atmosphere of crisis, when governments were only able to rule by decree because the parties couldn't get together and get behind a policy to deal with this massive economic collapse. In that situation, voters thought, this is the last straw. We've had hyperinflation, we've had international humiliation, we've got political chaos. The Nazis seem to be the one party that's led by youthful, determined, energetic individuals. They promoted the party actually in 1930 particularly as the Hitler movement, the Hitler Bewegung. This of course was after Hitler had had the ban on his public speaking lifted, and so he had been going around speaking a great deal. It's very difficult to find anything to which the party was willing to commit itself. They were very vague on what they intended to do. They seemed to have to offer something to every constituency in Germany: the worker, the manager, their middle-class women. What he was saying in one place wasn't necessarily compatible with what he was saying elsewhere. And in terms of, say, economic detail, we're going to make Germany great again, we're going to recover, we're going to have work for everybody, put Germany back on the international scene, we're going to rescue the German family, we'll give German women a much better life. These are all cliches, and when you probe, they really don't have any particular policies that they can actually present in a rational way to the general public. Much of it rested simply on that Germany will be rescued, Germany will become a great power, and hit the leader person to achieve it. Electoral success would come to the Nazis at the beginning of the 1930s, and their popularity continued to rise as the population grew more disillusioned with the established government. I think that the electoral success of Hitler's party in 1932 didn't necessarily reflect the strengths of the party itself or its ideological appeal. It really reflected the extraordinary crisis that Germany had gone through as a result of the Wall Street crash. And I think what a lot of German people did was they just looked around for some kind of messiah, and that's how Hitler was being sold to the public. The appeal was many-sided, and of course, their vision was of what they called a Volksgemeinschaft, a folk community, in which the party could represent all social classes and groups. Hitler stands for election as president in April 1932 against Hindenburg, who had been president since 1925, and he loses. But he comes second. He comes a pretty creditable second, and given him a much higher profile than he previously had, the propaganda continues, and in the election of July 1932, the Nazi Party gets 37 of the vote, and it's the largest single party in the Reichstag with 230 seats, more than doubling its 1930 total. That's a tremendous success. But Hitler is not offered the chancellorship. Actually, it was his democratic right to be offered the chancellorship, but he's not. He is offered the vice-chancellorship, and he turns it down. A large proportion of the middle class voted for the National Socialist Party in the July elections of 1932 as a protest to the Hindenburg government. By November, they had retracted their support. There is another election in November, and the Nazi vote declines to 33. So I think 196 seats in the Reichstag, but it's a matter of considerable disappointment. to a lot of followers. So what they do, they seem to be on the verge of their death cough, their death rattle. There is now not such a pressing need to offer Hitler the chancellorship. Local election votes and so on at the time are showing a decline in the Nazi vote. I mean, they might just have fizzled out. There is then a minor election in the state of Lippe, and what the Nazis do is flood it with their marketing resource. They throw everything at this miniature state of Lippe and they win, and it's at that point that Hindenburg finally invites Hitler to be part of a coalition government. The small country of conservative politicians decided they could manipulate Hitler, offered him the chancellorship, and that was the start. Adolf Hitler, leader of the German national movement, is made Chancellor of Germany, and Berlin goes wild in celebration of his victory. Having secured the role as Reich Chancellor, it took one more twist of fate in favor of the National Socialists to see the future of Germany take a deadly turn and hand Hitler complete control. The Wall Street crash had sent Germany into economic crisis. The nation was subjected to a second wave of spiraling inflation and soaring unemployment. However, it gave the National Socialist Party the means to win a large proportion of the vote in a relatively short space of time. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Reich Chancellor. His plan of total power was almost tangible. 4 weeks later, on February 27, 1933, at 9:25 p.m., an alarm call was taken in a Berlin fire station. Fire had broken out in the Reichstag building, the home of the German parliament. By 11:30 p.m., the fire was extinguished, but had left the building a gut shell. On searching the smoldering ruin, a young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was found. He was arrested for starting the fire. According to police, he acted out of rebellion, a call for the German workers to rise up against the oppression of fascism. The Nazis saw the Communist Party as a huge threat to National Socialism, and also knew that a large proportion of the German population was suspicious of the far left. Stalin having come to power late 1920s. You have the first 5-year plan in 1928. You have collectivization starting in 1929. Word gets back about what it means, and the last thing German peasants want is collectivization. A lot of German peasants, a lot of smallholders, they don't want collectivization, neither do the big landowners. The fire allowed Hitler to pass 2 sets of legislation, the first of which was the Reichstag Fire Decree. This was drawn up the day after the incident and signed by President Hindenburg. The decree allowed the enforced imprisonment of anyone opposed to the Nazi regime and action to be taken against any publication deemed critical of the cause. The decree led to the Enabling Act passed in Parliament on March 23, 1933. It gave the Nazi Party power to enforce laws without the intervention of the Reichstag. Passing of the Enabling Act essentially handed power to Hitler and the National Socialist Party. They immediately let it be known throughout Germany. Fritz Lustig, a Jewish immigrant who now resides in North London, was living in Berlin in 1933. I was born in 1919. I had a very happy childhood. I was the youngest of 4 siblings, and I had a very happy time at school. Although I experienced the Nazis coming to power, we were rehearsing for a play at school, and suddenly we heard martial music sounding, and we looked out of the window, and there was a Nazi demonstration passing with lit torches and a band at the head of the procession. We read in the papers the next day that there had been similar processions all over Berlin, and we just had been happening to watch the one which took place in that particular part of town. Applause. The national election of March 1933 saw the National Socialist Party take 43% of the vote, but they still failed to win a majority. Unbeknownst to the German population, this would be the last democratic election until World War II. So people still thought in March-April 1933 that the democratic system was not dead, but it was. We look at it backwards, we can see what happened. People even say, why did all these people vote for a party that unleashed war and genocide? Well, they didn't know that's what they were going to do. The Nazis had taken Germany by lawful means. Hitler's plan had worked, and although his party had still not managed to gain a majority, they had total power. They believed there was still an enemy who may stand in the way of this domination that would come from within the party itself. The termination of this enemy would culminate on July 2, 1934. The incident known as the Night of the Long Nights would see the murder of Ernst Röhm, the head of the Stamp Thailand. Hitler and the party leadership had arrived at the point where they felt they had to take on the Sturm up Thailand. Various senior paladins of the Reich feared the power of Rome. They coveted it for themselves, specifically Himmler, and so they began to tell Hitler that Rome was plotting against him, which was not in fact true. The army hated them because their rival source of power. I think from Hitler's point of view, the real problem was that he was worried that Rome really would develop a popular following, more popular, perhaps in the end, than the following for Hitler. There's a real distrust about Rome's motives and Rome's political ambitions. Material is very definitely number two to Hitler, and therefore is some sort of potential rival to his power, and they had already made weapon, and that was the SS, the Schutzstaffel. The SS were originally a small battalion of the much larger SA, but in 1929 Heinrich Himmler was appointed leader and, taking inspiration from Rome, began to rapidly expand the unit. Initially, they were Hitler's bodyguard, but by 1933, after the seizure of power, it became the internal security of the Nazi regime. By 1934, they were growing into a real unformidable private army, equipped famously with their black uniforms, black helmets with their own weaponry, and they did much of the business. When Hitler decided it was time to move against the SA using falsified evidence, Himmler had assembled a file which cited that Rome had been paid 12 million Deutschmarks by France to overthrow Hitler. In addition to this, Rome's homosexuality was used as a way of discrediting him. He and others in the SA leadership were accused of acts of drunkenness and debauchery. This was used as a way of excusing the action which Hitler was about to take. So it's an easy matter to set them up with allegations of internal corruption, particularly of homosexuality, and it was a chance to settle a lot of old scores. On the morning of June 30th, Hitler, with a large number of SS, marched into the hotel in Barvise, where Rome and many leaders of the SA were staying. They were arrested at gunpoint and later executed. It was a brutal business when the move was made. SA were taken totally by surprise, and much of their leadership was wiped out with the brutal execution of Rome and other potential opponents. Hitler sent a clear message to all that opposition would not be tolerated. The Jewish population and those on the left were already living with constant persecution, yet the Nazi Party's popularity amongst the German nation grew. The threat of violence, intelligent propaganda, and the complete monopoly of all institutions in Germany gave people no choice but to support. The National Socialist Party had not won a majority in any of the elections of the early 1930s. However, the passing of the Enabling Act saw Hitler gain complete control of Germany. In turn, the Night of the Long Nights had killed off any potential political threat he may have had. The German nation found themselves living under a dictatorship. Jews, communists, social democrats were all targeted as enemies of the state. Persecution, imprisonment, and systematic execution were all threats to these members of society. Working closely with Hitler, it was Joseph Goebbels who saw to it that the veneer of the Nazi Party would appeal to the masses. This campaign intensified once power had been consolidated, but its roots were set long before. The self-image that they wanted to create was of a movement of youth. The existing politicians were all in their 50s and 60s, and Nazis are in their 20s and 30s. The embodiment of all the energies of a new Germany, a new uncorrupted generation, the one party that's led by youthful, determined, energetic individuals. The Hitler Jugend or Hitler Youth were the personification of the Nazi image and gave the National Socialists a vibrant, youthful image. Because Hitler believes that too much education is dangerous, the young Nazi gets his only schooling after working hours, a daily lecture on Germany's need for expansion and the triumph he will share when German armies march into the rich wheat fields of the Russian Ukraine. Hitler Youth eventually became almost compulsory. The Nazis market them very, very heavily. In other words, what we'd imagine them to be as a rigidly a hierarchical organization with cruel discipline and bullying and so forth is not actually how they're self-presented. They're actually self-presented as a kind of adventure holiday. At 18, every young man must serve 6 months in the Arbeitsteams. There was one boy in my form whom I quite liked who was in the Hitler Youth. I was very keen on associating with him. I think he was less keen to associate with me. The man who was first given charge of it, Baldorf and Schira, was an able organizer, good at recruiting, but the real takeoff was only after the Nazis took power. Within 18 months, they were able to claim 3.5 million members, and that doesn't count, of course, the women's and girls' organizations that were set up in parallel. The girls' organization was called Bund. Deutscher Metal, the League of German Girls, a lot of young people who gravitated to the Hitler movement actually then influenced their parents. Not the other way around. It wasn't just youth groups that were monopolized by the Nazi Party. All organizations were in turn affected. The Nazis forced every single voluntary society organization in Germany to join the Nazi Party, become part of a Nazi apparatus that meant all orchestras, opera houses, singing clubs, amateur dramatic societies, all of that. They had to become part of the Reich Chamber of Culture, which is under the propaganda ministry. And of course, if you wanted to practice art and exhibit your work, you had to be admitted to the Chamber of Culture. And if you're Jewish, you wouldn't be admitted. If you're a modern artist, you wouldn't be admitted. So this is a way of imposing control. All aspects of life were effectively taken over by the National Socialists. These changes were witnessed by the school child Fritz Lustig. We had a new headmaster. Our current headmaster was not Jewish, but he was a social democrat, and therefore his politics were not acceptable to the Nazis, and a new headmaster was appointed. He introduced several new measures. One of them was that the weekly Monday morning assembly was completely transformed after everybody had sat down. One of the boys who was stationed at the entrance door shouted attention, and then the headmaster walked in along the central aisle, all through the hall with his arm outstretched in the Hitler salute, turned smartly around. When he reached the podium, shouted "Heil Hitler," and the whole school had to answer with the same. I suppose I must have outstretched my hand in the Hitler salute, because not to do that would have thrown attention to me. I didn't want to draw attention to myself by raising the question of whether I was excluded today. The Nazi propaganda machine is seeking to make Adolf Hitler the only god of the German people. How to destroy every established religion, as the party took control of all areas of society and permeated into the lives of every German citizen. The need for greater, more effective propaganda became paramount. There was nothing which wasn't propaganda of one sort or another. Every surface was interrogated for its propaganda potential. The press was censored, and Nazi newspapers really had the lion's share of circulation. The Volksempfänger, the People's Radio, was an affordable device manufactured on the orders of Joseph Goebbels. More people owning radios meant a larger audience for propaganda, the propaganda to confuse, to make them lose faith, to divide and conquer, to lull the fears of the little neutrals. Propaganda minister Goebbels told them Germany didn't want a war at all. It was Britain and France that caused all the trouble. Radio was taken over, and there was a Reich broadcasting company, and radio, of course, was dominated completely by state output. 70 of German homes owned a radio by 1939. There were loudspeakers installed on lamp posts and trees, and when any of these features took place, of course, you were expected to stand still and listen to them. Film production was taken over by the Nazis as well. José Goebbels was very much aware of the fact that people would get bored very quickly if they were subjected to constant barrage of propaganda about how wonderful the Nazis where he was rather upset when Hitler commissioned a propaganda film at the Nuremberg Valley of 1934 from young actress Leni Riefenstahl. Triumph of the Will was a film directed by Leni Riefenstahl which documents the 1934 Nuremberg rally. Its main themes are unity and returning power to Germany. It was no mistake that Nazi symbolism and imagery are prominent throughout the film. Hitler understood the power of the Nazi brand. You actually have a core brand symbol system. You have obviously the swastika, you have the stylized eagle, you have the other things like the oak leaves, the acorns. Then of course there's the uniforms. I once counted up the number of uniforms in Nazi Germany are about 150. These uniforms are highly symbolic. For example, the SS uniforms were vaguely modeled on the death's head hazards of German history, which was a black uniform with the scarlet crossbones and the stark silver. This was a way of boosting morale, of boosting identity, of priming solidarity, the brown shirts. And since the story of Hitler cannot be told objectively in 2 videos, I suggest we pause for now and continue in the 3rd part. Thank you once again for the support you have shown me. I hope the time spent with me has been enjoyable for you. Until next time,